Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Midlife Wellness MP podcast. My name's Kim Hefner. I'm a board certified family nurse practitioner, menopause specialist, and host of this podcast. So welcome. Well, my next guest is a writer and a journalist. She is the author of the book, The Cycle, Confronting the Pain of Periods and PMDD. She's the co-author of the book, The Power of Trust. Her work has been featured in The Atlantic, Fortune, Fast Company, ESPN, and Harvard Business Review, to name a few. She is the recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship, and she attended the Columbia School of Journalism and Johns Hopkins. I'm excited to welcome Shalene Gupta to the podcast. Shalene, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So the first thing I want to know is, how did you go from writing about the power of trust in corporations to taking this very personal turn discussing your own struggles with PMDD?
Oh, I love that question because you know what? When I sent my agent this book, he was just like, not quite what I was expecting. He's like, if anything, I thought you were going to write another business book. And I was like, completely valid. So essentially what ended up happening is actually, while I was in the process of writing the trust book, I got diagnosed with PMDD.
Mm.
And it was shocking to me because, PMDD had shaped a lot of my life, and it had really caused severe and significant problems for me, but I had no idea what was going on. And, you know, I live close to, Harvard Medical School. I have access to top quality doctors. I live in a city with one of the few PMDD clinics available in the country, and I still had never heard about this. And it just made me wonder, who else is out there who's suffering, who has no idea, and might never know, because we have so many hangups about talking about periods and mental health. So if you've got something that's the intersection of both, which is what PMDD is, you might never hear about it.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's still pretty misunderstood, probably misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed by Western medicine anyway. So, what is PMDD for those of us who don't know or haven't experienced it? And why is it still so relatively unknown?
Oh, the questions that led me to write my book. So essentially, PMDD stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And what this means is really severe mood swings like anger, rage, depression, anxiety, right before your period or even when you're bleeding, but essentially during part of your menstrual cycle. And when I say like depression, anxiety, rage, I'm not talking about I feel a little grumpy or I feel a little sad. I mean, to the point that you can't function. 70% of people with PMDD have regular suicidal ideation. A third have attempted suicide at least once. Like, this
Wow.
is really, really serious. And about 5 to 10% of the population has that. And by
Mm.
the way, that's what counts as PMDD, which has a really strict criteria. There are people who have, so in order to be counted as PMDD, you need to have up to you need to have 5 symptoms.
Mm.
There are people who might just get, a little, they might just get really severe anxiety, but not the rest of it. And since that technically isn't PMDD, they don't even have something where they can go to a doctor and ask for help.
Mm.
And that is really, really frustrating to me.
Yeah. So, what are what five symptoms do you have to have, or what meets the criteria?
Oh my God. I used to have this memorized. It's listed in the DSM.
Okay.
Um, but you can go look it up, Google it if you
Okay.
think you might have PMDD. And
Okay.
it's basically having these 5 symptoms. I think they give you a spread of 11. And if you have 5 of them, to the point that it's interfering with your ability to function, you're a good candidate for a PMDD diagnosis.
Now, when it comes to suffering with PMDD, do you feel like it's often just downplayed as bad PMS? And in your book, do you differentiate between PMS and PMDD?
Yes, so that is a great question. And part of the reason we haven't heard about PMDD is essentially we've known that there are issues, and right around the 1950s and 60s, there was a PMDD researcher who actually came up with the term PMS. And she ran some of the early studies and realized that this was an issue. Now, in the 1980s, doctors and psychiatrists said, it looks like there's something up here. We should get this in the DSM, which is this diagnostic manual for that doctors use to figure out, who has a mental health disorder and what the criteria should be. And there was an enormous debate and this huge fight because at the time, people were still trying to parse out, what is PMS, which is kind of, I'm a little bit grumpy, I'm a little bit irritable, but, life is still working, versus what is PMDD, where in my case, I was having fights that were ruining my relationship, like
Mm,
knockout, screaming fights, self-harm, at times attempting suicide. And then
mm,
I've heard this from more than one person with PMDD.
mm.
Versus like, okay, I'm a little bit irritable, right? There's a difference.
Yeah.
And experts weren't quite sure what the prevalence was. So their estimates were varied from like, okay, 3% of the population has this to 90%. And there was this confusion about the two. And then women feminists got really worried because they were like, oh my God, this is tantamount to saying women are crazy.
Yeah. Oh, I can
And
see that. I
there
can
was
see
a right, exactly. And so there was a lot of debate about how severe does it need to be to count as PMDD. Honestly, there's still discussions going on. Um, I was talking, this is like cutting edge research now, but at the moment, the PMDD criteria includes physical pain and cramps. There has been some discussion about maybe taking that out because it sort of confuses and conflates some of these like really severe psychiatric and mood symptoms
that.
with, is it also just a really, really painful period?
Yeah. So is it typically like, okay, you said before your period, and then once you start your period, a couple days later, does all of that kind of just totally subside and you're kind of like, I'm back to myself. I feel fine. Or is it still, is it just during that time period? Or does it kind of resolve and then the cycle restarts each month?
Such a great question. So I'm going to say it varies from person to person. So classic PMDD is that kind of on-off switch. A lot of times it gets misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. So in my case, I am extremely conflict averse. I'm pretty calm, very chill, sometimes like too chill, I would say. Um, and then I ovulate and I get this kind of like slow creep of depression and anxiety, but it's like, I can still like put a lid on it or just be like, I'm gonna go to yoga and talk to a friend.
Mhm.
And then like a couple days before my period, I would get into these like god awful fights with my partner, like
Mhm.
screaming, like, we are done. I want a divorce, like we are over. The kind where it's like, and like I love my partner. He's great. No reason at all. Like he did nothing. This is me. Um, and then my period would come and then that switch would flip again. And
Mhm.
as you can imagine, if I had no idea this, when I had no idea this was PMDD, for everyone else, it was like, she's nuts, right? Like, what is wrong?
Yeah.
And like for myself, it was just like, what is like, how can I treat someone I love like this?
Yeah. Which
And
probably just makes you feel so much worse.
oh, you feel terrible about
Yeah.
yourself, right? Like I just accepted for a long time that I was a really bad person because there was no way I could, when I felt better and I looked at what had happened, it was just like, I have no explanation. I cannot justify this. This is not who I want to be. And I would try to change I went through so many things like,
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah, like
Yeah.
I'm, and I could predict these fights with my partner within a day or two of accuracy. And we would sit down and be like, okay, what do we need to figure out? What issues do we need to bottom out? Let's get ahead of this. We know it's coming. And we could never get ahead of it.
Wow. So, how did you eventually get diagnosed? Did you start like tracking your cycles on a tracker, monitoring, diary of your symptoms? And like, how did you end up getting diagnosed properly?
So this the ideal world, the way you're supposed to get diagnosed is you're supposed to track your symptoms for 2 months or 2 cycles.
Mhm.
And there's a great tracker online. Go to IAPMD and it's called the DRSP. And there's 11 different symptoms and you track them every day. Um, Here's the thing though, that rarely happens. Most doctors don't know enough about PMDD to tell people to go do that.
Okay.
A lot of people with PMDD are self-diagnosed. So what happened in my case was I already knew from years of experience that I could predict a fight with my partner within a couple days of my period. And what ended up happening is after 6 years, my long-term boyfriend was like, we're done.
Mm,
It was completely heartbreaking.
yeah.
But I started dating someone new, and in that previous relationship, there had just been a lot of external factors that were not present in the new one in terms of just personality differences. And maybe we weren't like the best fit and dealing with long distance.
Mhm.
None of that was present with my new partner. Not only that, we entered COVID lockdown. So anything that I could blame on stress before was completely eliminated because I was in my apartment. And it became very clear, okay, I'm still having fights on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Everything in my life has changed, but the pattern is still here.
Mm,
So this to me, something is wrong. And I just Googled severe anger before your period, came across PMDD, went, oh my God, this is me. And I called my doctor, and I'm lucky. I had a spectacular doctor who was like, I believe you. You have all this data from, years and years of, okay, this is when I'm going to fight with my partner. Um, and she was wonderful. Not everyone has that experience. A lot of people have just been told they're terrible people. I talked to somebody who was sent to be tested for diabetes of all things.
mm.
And there's, just it's not an easy journey necessarily.
Yeah. Is historically has Western medicine kind of dismissed this or, missed catching it? And then, and is there still like a stigma surrounding this?
Yeah, the history is a great question. So, I mean, in general, with Western medicine, right, like right around the Victorian era, we get the idea of hysteria. And I think that's really kind of muddied the waters because hysteria was very much kind of a sexist disease. There's this entire history, which I go over in my book, of
Mhm.
Uh, originally, like in the 17 and 1800s, if people thought about somebody who was mentally ill, they thought about a man. This switched to a woman during the Victorian era
Wow.
due to some political changes, economic changes, policy changes in terms of who was treating mental illness and who was given the power. It was essentially like taken out of women's hands and given to men's. So now, there is essentially a grain of truth in hysteria in that PMDD is real, right? Like there is something that's linked to your period. On the other hand, we've lived in a society that's so steeped in sexism and ignoring women's health. There's been, and I'm sure you know this, an entire movement to just ignore periods and the effect on the body because the logic was women and men are the same except for hormones, but that doesn't matter. It turns out hormones do matter.
Yes.
So
Yes, they matter a lot.
they matter a lot. But we've just, women's health is just completely understudied. So it's only, and then as I mentioned before, we have that huge fight in the 1980s where women are starting to achieve parity at work. They're starting to be taken more seriously. This PMDD fight comes out, and essentially what women are saying is, oh, we're getting into the workforce, and this is a way to discredit us.
Mm,
Today, I'm hopeful that we can have a different conversation, which is simply that men and women have different biologies. Hormones have an impact, and it is inhumane and actually sexist to let women suffer without letting them know what's going on, and that you can have PMDD and still be smart and capable and have a lot to offer society. And it doesn't mean that you're lesser or you're crazy or mentally ill. I know it's a mental illness and like this is a tautology, but essentially, we're not helping anyone by not treating people with PMDD.
no. In fact, how many women have lost their lives committing suicide and are and just living in this isolation and thinking they're crazy? You
Yeah.
know, it's interesting because back in the day, menopause was similar.
Yeah.
They just kind of thought women were crazy, you know? And then it turns out, eventually they figured out hormones were related. But then it was kind of just like treat everybody the same, put them on this. I feel like it's just pretty typical to kind of have that stigma with
Yeah.
women with whatever phase they're going through.
Very much so. One of the doctors I was interviewing essentially mentioned that when we're going through the menstrual cycle, our brains are going through the same amount of change that they would be if you were taking barbiturates. So
Wow.
she's like, PMDD is not surprising. What is surprising is that more people don't actually have issues because these changes are so immense. And frankly, the menstrual cycle is so poorly understood. Until I was diagnosed with PMDD, I didn't realize there was a follicular phase and a luteal phase. I didn't realize that ovulation has a huge impact in what's going on with your hormones and therefore what might happen to you. And if we lived in a society that was not sexist, this would be drilled into us really quickly. And I think there would be an acceptance of, okay, there's, a cyclical season to women's health, and that's okay. That's who they are, and things might look a little different from time to time, depending on what week they're in, and that's acceptable.
Yeah. And then the influences, maybe environmental, lifestyle, those
Mhm.
type of things probably play a role in severity. I know you obviously looked really in depth on the drivers of PMDD. And could you just explain what you found? And was there a genetic component to this as well?
Yeah, so PMDD, what the research says is that PMDD is an adverse reaction to a normal change in hormones. So there was this really famous study where a researcher suppressed ovulation in women, and then he started adding back hormones. And what he found is when the hormones changed, people with PMDD had horrible symptoms. But when the hormone levels were held steady, no matter what they were, there were no symptoms. Because
Mm.
previously there had been ideas that maybe this is a hormone imbalance or someone is struggling. And so that's where you kind of see that change, right, with the ovulation, where you have the hormones going, cresting and then nose diving, and then you see that change again right before your period. I'm so sorry, I forgot your other question.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was talking about is there a genetic component? But you know what might be helpful, real quick, is just explaining how the hormones do change. Initially, estrogen is kind of dominant in that follicular phase, and then you kind of peaks, and then you have the ovulation. And then in that luteal phase, progesterone tends to be more dominant as well. So I guess I've kind of heard about progesterone intolerance, progesterone insensitivity, also kind of possibly playing a role in PMDD. So I'd be interested to know, I guess, first what I asked was genetic influences, but then also, is that true? Is progesterone in that second part of the phase, the luteal phase, does that play a role in PMDD?
Yeah, so great questions. I'm going to give you an overview of what I know. I also want to caveat, I am not a scientist or a
Yeah,
researcher or a clinician,
right.
so I always worry I'm going to mess this up.
No,
But
and no, you're
essentially,
fine. Just like, what you've learned and
whatever,
experienced
yeah.
and your research is fabulous.
So what they found out so far is that progesterone um, converts to a neurosteroid in the brain called allopregnanolone. And a lot of people with PMDD seem to have an allopregnanolone intolerance. Scientists are still trying to figure out what exactly is going on in the brain at the end. And so I have this newsletter where I'm interviewing people with the latest papers on PMDD to unpack this because there's still a little bit of I think I just interviewed someone where they found out that it might actually be pregnenolone levels, not allopregnanolone.
Mm,
So we're still trying to, there's still like what exactly is happening at the brain level um, is still up for discussion. Now, another open-ended question for PMDD is there might be different subtypes because what they found is some people respond beautifully to treatment.
mm,
Others don't. Not only that, there's differences in the timing for some people. Some people real, ovulation's a real doozy. Other people, it's just the luteal phase. Other people, it's the bleeding. Um, and so what one of the key researchers, Dr. Tori Eisenlohr-Moll, hypothesizes is that there might be three different subtypes which line up with different types of sensitivities. One of them might be a progesterone sensitivity, and another one might be an estrogen withdrawal sensitivity, where it's actually the lowering of the estrogen, which is the issue.
mm.
Scientists also Oh my goodness, I had this in my book, but they, in terms of genetics, they do think there's a correlation, but there's also a wide range in what percent they ascribe this to be. So it essentially translates to they think there's a genetic correlation, but they're not entirely sure.
Okay. So ovulation, is it just that dive in hormones then that drop? And if so, you would think one after pregnancy would maybe possibly experience something like this, or in that postpartum phase when you lose those hormones drop suddenly, you know?
A lot of people I've talked to with PMDD have said pregnancy was amazing because they're not ovulating anymore. They don't go into that second luteal phase. But then after pregnancy, there's this horrible crash, and it's like worst PMDD of their lives. I haven't done a whole lot of research on postpartum and what
Yeah.
happens with PMDD and the confluence of that, but what we know is that there's a change, people with PMDD are really sensitive to changes in hormone levels.
So, as far as treatments, solutions, is this something that people are put on birth control for? Like, what have you found as far as treatments?
Yeah, so the first line treatments are either birth control or antidepressants. And what's really sad is that for a lot of people, these are actually great treatments that work wonders.
Mm.
Um, so the percentage prevalence for how well antidepressants work varies. I've heard researchers say it's up to 90%. I've heard other researchers say it's 30% or 50%. What I will say anecdotally is antidepressants gave me my life back. And honestly, like if you're at the point, like I've talked to so many people where they were at the point of divorce, losing their job, couldn't keep a career down. You know, what do you have to lose with trying an antidepressant or birth control?
Right.
Um, with birth control, there is one FDA approved birth control to treat PMDD. Uh, Anecdotal, I took it. It made it worse for me.
Okay.
I just did an interview with a researcher who kind of reviewed all of the information we have on birth controls and PMDDs. And essentially, since we don't know if they're different subtypes, we don't actually kind of know who will react well to which birth control. I
Mm.
went on another one. It was fantastic.
Mm.
So there is a little bit of a journey to all of this. Now, there are some people where neither birth control nor SSRIs work. And then at that point, it's pretty much you're looking at surgery.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Like hysterectomy?
Yeah, oophorectomy.
Yeah, like taking the over. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
that's a lot.
this is where I wish there was more research because you'd think that we have more options beyond SSRI, birth control, surgery. You know,
Yeah.
that gets pretty extreme pretty quickly. And I have talked to people who did the surgery and it was worth it to them. And that's
Yeah. I mean, I can see, like, if
yeah,
you're suffering that bad, I
right,
can see. With
right.
the SSRIs, is that something that people could take 2 weeks of the month, or is it pretty much all the time? Like,
So it
can it be
depends.
successful 2 weeks of the month?
Yeah. So I am on a low dose. I'm on 10 milligrams. I take it 2 weeks a month. I wear this Aura ring, which tells me when I ovulate by measuring my temperature. As soon as I ovulate, I take Prozac.
Okay.
Um, so there have been lots of studies which show that it can be used intermittently. And here's the thing, like antidepressants typically take 4 to 6 weeks to work. For
Yeah.
PMDD, they've been shown to be effective in as little as 12 hours.
Wow.
And that's
That's
something,
cool.
again, like not a lot of doctors know. I was just talking to my PCP about PMDD, and he was like, "Oh, I don't know, you're on kind of a low dose. Like, should you just be on this all the time? And should we like quadruple your dose?" And I was like, "No, it's actually under control." Like, I see no
Yeah.
reason. Yeah.
I find that hopeful because SSRIs are known to have some symptoms or some side effects, weight gain, possibly sexual dysfunction, some fatigue. So I think that's awesome and encouraging that people could take it 2 weeks a month, possibly, and see benefit. I mean, that's a great thing. And as far as birth control, I can see there's some that are, the progestin part of it would probably play a big role because, it's more that are similar to the progesterone your body makes. And then there's some that are similar to testosterone, even in chemical structure. So I can see why that would vary. But there's those two options. But what about diet? Is there any diet or, anything with diet that can be helpful? Stress reduction,
Oh my God.
exercise.
No, I get this question a lot. And so I'm going to start with this personal caveat of like, I really tried everything. There was a year where I quit sugar. And when I say I quit sugar, I mean, I didn't have bread, I didn't have ketchup.
Wow.
I had some of the worst PMDD episodes of my entire life. And that may have also just been because it was a time, I was teaching abroad, I was in a new relationship, there was a lot going on externally. Um, and I feel like a lot of times I meet with people who, I think there's a big stigma against SSRIs. So it's a, hey, what can I do in terms of my diet and eating clean and manage that? So that's when I get really worried because I think there's a way in which people tend to feel like PMDD isn't necessarily real. And if you just like eat salad, it'll be okay. So yes, like eating healthy is important. I do find exercise really helpful for moderating my mood. It's been a great coping mechanism. If I feel myself spiraling, I'll like go for a run or I'll go do yoga. Um, but to me, it's kind of it's a multi-pronged, right? Like it's my medication, it's also having a life that I really like. My partner is great. And even when I wasn't medicated, just being in the right relationship made such a big difference.
Yeah.
Um, I have a career that I love, and again, like that made a big difference.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a certain amount of yes, like
Yeah.
if you're not happy with your life, your PMDD will be worse. Kind of,
Right. Everything.
yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like menopause, I think. Like a
Yeah.
lot of people just like, I just want to exercise or I just want to, and it's not that all of those things don't help. They improve your overall quality of life and your lifespan, health span. But definitely there's women that need hormone replacement therapy, and that is okay. It's like the same thing. It's like take away that stigma and get help, get therapy so that your quality of life is worth living and you do enjoy your life. So that is great points. um, well, in your book it seems like you went through some historical and feminist perspectives surrounding menstrual health. What were some of the things you found in that regard? Anything surprise you?
I don't think I had realized the depth of the stigma. So, when I first started writing this book, I went through a huge wave of shame. I was just like, I don't want to write about my period. I don't want to write about mental health. People are going to think I'm crazy. And I felt
Oh,
like people would think I was dirty, like somehow
mm,
tainted because I really kind of grew up where in a place where people weren't talking about their periods. Like my mom was great about talking to me about periods, but it was kind of understood this was you know, um, within the family. And I was not supposed to like go outside being like, oh, look, I'm on my period, because no one else was doing that.
yeah.
Um, and then, I got into the history and I got so mad because, from the get-go, at least, with the Western canon, we have the ancient Romans and Greeks talking about, I think it was Pliny the Elder talking about how menstrual blood is poisonous and um, it was insane. Like at some point he goes around like feeding blood to dogs or something. Like, and then, we have, in the Middle Ages, this idea that, woman like that it leaves you susceptible to like demonic possession. And it's just this compounding ignorance of not understanding what's going on and not looking into it, and then just essentially shaming women for bleeding and not taking care of them because there's so many cultures that have menstrual taboos where you're not supposed to talk about it. And so what happens then is I found the study essentially of like 12-year-old boys in Taiwan. And the researchers asked them about periods, and they were essentially like, yeah, I was curious about periods. And then my mom slapped me and said, you're really gross. Or my sister was like, that's disgusting. Don't talk about it. And they
Mm.
were shamed by the adults around them. And if you think about it, what's going to happen to these little boys in 10 years when they become policymakers, doctors, fathers, husbands? they've been told periods are dirty, they don't understand them. So they're not going to create a society that has the infrastructure that we need to be able to just bleed. And you see this with developing countries where they don't build adequate toilets. So then little girls are dropping out as soon as they hit adolescence. And then that affects their income downstream. And so essentially what we've done is we've screwed women over because we are not willing to talk about periods, and it's unacceptable.
Wow. How do you think it is these days? Like, what changes have you seen? Do you feel like we've come a long way, or are we still struggling with that?
I am really heartened by the fact that we are having conversation. The fact that you and I are talking about this, I feel like is absolutely positive change. I honestly don't think my book could have been published maybe 10 years ago.
Mm.
Um, so we're having the conversation now, and that's great. But menstrual stigmas still exist. And I feel it. Like people will go and ask me, they'll be like, "Oh, you're a writer. What did you write?" And I'm always like, "I wrote a book on trust." And they're like, "Anything recently?" And depending on who's asking me, I might say, I might not mention it. I might say it's a book on PMDD, or I might just be like, women's health.
Mm.
And that to me says, I think we still have a long way to go. Like, it's great we're having the conversation. We need to have more of them.
No doubt. I feel like in general, women's health has just been underserved in so many areas. Menopause, perimenopause. I mean, women have suffered in silence for a long time. And it's unfortunate that a majority of studies are just done on men. And we're not little men. We're not like men. I mean, we are so different. And it just saddens me like how many women have gone without and suffered because we don't have the research or the guidelines are behind or we just don't want to talk about it or we tell women this is just a part of being a woman. This is natural, you know, and that's awful. And I'm hoping that these conversations are changing and women as a whole are becoming more using their voice and speaking out more and not accepting those answers.
I love so much about that because, like, I'm going through IVF right now, and
Okay.
just the amount of, I feel like, sexism that's baked into the care, where it's just, you might experience a little bit of discomfort. I was in pain. Like, I could not move for a few
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
And the way we expect women to carry that, and the guilt, because I was like, oh my goodness, I was told this was discomfort. Am I just being a wimp? And that's how I'd felt about my painful periods and my PMDD. I'd had a partner actually say, you're kind of a baby about your period. You just stop functioning, and maybe you should push through this. And we would not accept or tolerate this level of pain for men. We would say that's inhumane. And we have done that when we test birth controls, right? Like the symptoms for male birth control, people are like, oh, stop the studies.
Right. No doubt. Yeah, women, we are incredible. We tolerate a lot. And regardless of what it is, there's always something that is to be said about a woman, whether a woman tries to breastfeed but can't, suddenly she's failed, oh, you have to bottle feed. It's like, seriously? It's like, why do we do this to women? And other women do it to women. It's like, no. And the same thing with menopause. You're not there yet. But, oh, I'm going to do it natural. And if somebody's on hormone therapy or an antidepressant, oh, you're taking medicine or you're over medicalizing menopause. It's like, why do we do this? You know? And on the other hand, it's like really nobody's business how you manage your own care. Honestly, it's like that's a personal experience. But women, we need to be better with each other as well, I think.
Absolutely. And I read somewhere that a lot of that idea of natural birth is better came from, back in the Middle Ages, there was this Christian idea that the pain of birth is punishment for having sex.
Oh my goodness.
And the moment I heard that, I was like, I'm so done with the idea that natural is better for birth. Like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
like, no, it's just not acceptable. And I think we need to be unpacking some of these stigmas. I also do want to mention I know I've been using the word woman, but there are people who are not women who do menstruate and have PMDD and they don't identify, that's not their gender identity. And that's also a really painful journey for them, also to get, care that
Yeah.
works for them.
Yeah. And I think we've come a long way in
Yeah.
that regard. I think we really are working to, include everybody, which is great. Um, but yeah, I'm with you. I feel like there's always, when it comes to women or just, in general, there's always a stigma about something, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'm hoping it's changing even for the women that I care for in perimenopause and menopause, and just accepting their own journey and it's their own experience. And if they need help, that's okay. It's quality of life matters. So, yeah. Well, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you feel is important to share?
I just want to give a shout out to everyone who deals with a painful period or who deals with mood symptoms. And I want to say it's not your fault. You are not weak. This is not a personal failing. This is society has failed us and the medical system has failed us. And it's well worth do some symptom tracking and get that data if you suspect anything is kind of just not working, because there's research showing that the menstrual cycle can exacerbate underlying disorders, even, as diverse as epilepsy, migraines, just if you have a mood disorder like anxiety or depression. And researchers are still not, and clinicians are just not taking into account how your menstrual cycle might affect that.
Wow. So definitely your key takeaways would be start tracking your cycle, maybe using something like you're using your Aura ring to kind of track when you ovulate. Is there anything else that you feel you want to leave as some key takeaways that you've, covered in your book, or maybe you just want people to leave with?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you suspect you have PMDD or premenstrual exacerbation, which is when your cycle is exacerbating and making an underlying disorder worse, check out IAPMD, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization with tons of resources for diagnosis, treatment, getting help, as well as peer counseling. And also, again, just be gentle with yourself. If you need help, you deserve it. Ask for it. And if you meet an asshole, find a new provider.
No doubt. That is a great point. If you don't get the right answer, there's other people out there that will listen. No, that's a great point, because I hear that all the time. They're just kind of dismissed or, ignored, and they suffer for years before they finally find somebody else, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much for being here. I've loved learning about this topic. Like I said, I hadn't known much about it. We had never talked about it. So, really happy to come upon your book, and thank you for sharing your personal story. I mean, that's very vulnerable, and that means a lot. And I just wish you the best, and all of women that are suffering. I mean, just getting the right help. So, thank you so much.
Kim, thank you so much for having me and for all you do to raise awareness for women's health. Truly doing the work we need.
Thank you so much. All right. Hopefully, we can meet again, maybe with your next book.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.